Through the course of the Gospels, we are introduced to the 12 apostles. There were 12 disciples that were uniquely chosen. They were given special authority. They were present for many of the events of the Gospels. And they were the ones entrusted with carrying on those teachings. For example, we see in Matthew 10, 1 through 2, "And calling the 12 disciples of him, he gave to them authority over unclean spirits, so as to cast them out and to heal." The 12 apostles, the names are these. First, Simon, the one called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James of the Zebedee. We can see that these 12 disciples were supposed to be given special power and authority, and there were 12 of them. The passage goes on to name them and refers to them as the 12 apostles: Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and so forth. The apostles are even given a further future role, according to Matthew 19:28. "When the Son of Man shall sit on his throne of glory, also you on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." According to Matthew, there are to be 12 thrones for the 12 apostles. And when Revelation describes the New Jerusalem, it refers to the 12 apostles. Revelation 21:14, "And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." Clearly, the 12 are given an exalted role, according to books like the Gospels and Revelation. One interesting thing about this is the status of Judas. We know the story about the betrayal by Judas, and he was a part of the 12. So who are we to consider the 12 as a result of that? Is he included still, or is there a different 12? If we go by Acts, we can see a new 12th apostle was appointed. Acts 1:26, "And they gave their lots, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles." Matthias was chosen to replace Judas, and he was numbered among the original apostles. And later, we see reference to the 12 again. Acts 6:2, "But the 12 called to the multitude of the disciples." By this point, apparently they were considered the 12 again, because Matthias joined with the other apostles. There were 12 apostles at this point in Acts. If we consider what it says in the Gospels and in Revelation, the 12 hold a special significance. And going by the beginning of Acts, the place of Judas was filled by Matthias, and they were once again called the 12. However, this doesn't account for the primary author of the New Testament, who also refers to himself as an apostle, that is, Paul. Paul was not among the 12 from the beginning. He was not actually a part of the disciples, and he wasn't present for the events or teachings of the Gospels. He asserts that he himself is an apostle, specifically an apostle to the Gentiles. While this is a notion that we can see Paul refer to a number of times in his own books, we may not have seen how Peter says something different in Acts 15:7. Peter said to them, "God chose among us that through my mouth the Gentiles hear the word of the gospel and believe." According to Acts, Peter was supposedly the chosen apostle to go speak to the Gentiles. This presumably harkens back to the often misinterpreted vision with the sheet full of animals, which meant that he wasn't supposed to consider any man to be common or unclean, according to Acts 10:28. This referred to a custom of not eating among the Gentiles. Peter says he was uniquely chosen among the apostles to speak to the Gentiles, which is an interesting statement to consider. With the existence of these 12 apostles, we might consider why they were chosen, how they were in close proximity to the original teachings, and how they were specifically reared up for a purpose. On the other hand, Paul is admittedly a different situation. Let's allow Paul to explain his own background and his relationship with the apostles. Galatians 1:15-20. But when it pleased God, the one separating me from my mother's womb and calling through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I may preach him in the nations, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. Neither I went up into Jerusalem toward the apostles before me, but I came into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I came up to Jerusalem to visit Peter, and I stayed with him 15 days. But of the other apostles I saw not, except James, the brother of the Lord. But these I am writing to you, behold, in God's sight that I am lying not. According to Paul, he did not receive his apostleship or his teachings from any man or through any man, but instead he received it by a unique revelation given to him alone. When this took place, he did not confer with anyone, not with flesh and blood, and he did not go to speak with the 12 apostles. It wasn't until 3 years later that he visited Peter for a few days and saw James also. And then he tells his readers to make sure that we do not distrust him, because he says he is not lying. Unlike the apostles, Paul says he received his gospel independent of witnessing any teaching, and he did not confer with the apostles either. Keep in mind the role and the authority that we saw placed upon the 12. But Paul had a different view of things. As we continue in Galatians, we will see his attitude toward the apostles and how he states his disagreement with them. Galatians 2:1-14. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took Titus also. I went up according to revelation, and submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, separately to the one seeming of repute, lest somehow I may run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised because of the false brethren smuggled in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom which we have in Christ, that they should enslave us, to whom not for an hour we gave place to the subjugation, that the truth of the gospel should continue toward you. Yet from those seeming to be something, whatever they once were mattered nothing to me. God accepts not a man's person. For the one's seeming conferred nothing to me. But instead, perceiving that I was committed the gospel of the uncircumcision, as Peter was of the circumcision. For the one working Peter into apostleship of the circumcision works also in me into the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, the ones seeming to be pillars, knew the grace that was given unto me, They gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of the fellowship, that we should go unto the Gentiles, yet they unto the circumcision. Only that we would remember the poor, which I also endeavored to do this same thing. This is a curious version of things considering what we've seen so far. This meeting that Paul refers to may be in reference to Acts 15, in part because of the circumcision reference. Circumcision is actually a part of the commands in a number of ways. For example, such that a Gentile is not allowed to participate in the Passover if they are uncircumcised, according to Exodus 12:48. Despite this, Paul's follower was not compelled to do so. Paul refers to false brethren sneaking in to enslave them, yet he opposed them. Then we see some interesting statements, some regarding Paul's attitude toward the apostles, and some regarding being an apostle to the Gentiles. First, we have reference to those seeming to be something. Whatever they once were mattered nothing to me. And the ones seeming conferred nothing to me. He goes on to state that James, Cephas, and John, Cephas presumably being Peter, are the ones seeming to be pillars. According to Revelation, the 12 apostles were supposed to be foundations. So if one believes that and believes that the 12 apostles are credible and legitimate, then I'm not sure where those seeming to be something, whatever they once were, mattered nothing to me, would come from, or why the ones seeming conferred nothing to me, if they actually were given special authority and were the ones uniquely charged with continuing the teachings given in the Gospels. If they were teachers with authority, then why would they confer nothing to him and matter nothing? Next, we have reference to the apostleship of the circumcision and of the Gentiles. We see plainly in Acts, both through the vision that Peter describes and the meaning of it, and through Peter's statement in the council, that Peter was supposed to be the apostle chosen to speak to the Gentiles. However, we see plainly in Galatians that Paul has a different description of things. Paul says, I was committed the gospel of the uncircumcision, as Peter was of the circumcision. And he even goes on to say that the ones seeming to be pillars, which included Cephas or Peter, supposedly charged Paul and Barnabas with speaking to the Gentiles, while the apostles would not. Instead, the apostles would not go unto the Gentiles, according to Paul. So if this is supposed to be the case, I'm not sure what the purpose of Peter's vision or Peter's statement is, or what the legitimacy would be behind it. As the passage continues, we see a conflict explicitly outlined by Paul that he had with the apostle Peter and with those associated with James. Yet when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, that he was to be condemned. For before those came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. Yet when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those of the circumcision. And him and the rest of the Jews played the hypocrite, such that Barnabas also was led with them into hypocrisy. But when I perceived that they walked not uprightly toward the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of all, if you, being a Jew, live as a Gentile and not as a Jew? Why are you forcing the Gentiles to be Jewish? Paul was, by his own standard, unique and not actually a part of the 12. He said he received his teachings through his own personal revelation rather than being present for the teachings of the Gospels like Peter and the apostles were. Either coincidentally or as a direct byproduct of this, Paul is at odds with Peter and with those that were associated with James. Paul stood against Peter to the face because he was to be condemned. It's possible that Peter was doing wrong, that even though he was the chosen apostle, that he was also a hypocrite and was supposed to be condemned. Though we might also look to Acts 10, where Peter actually explains this specific behavior. Regardless, Paul stands against him here, because Peter was eating with the Gentiles until the men came from James. We might also consider that this James is likely to be the same James that Paul referred to earlier, James, the brother of the Lord. So Peter withdrew from the Gentiles when those associated with James, presumably James, the brother of the Lord, arrived. These men were of the circumcision. Paul goes on to say that the Jews played the hypocrite, including Barnabas, whom Paul also had a falling out with at the end of Acts 15. Barnabas and Peter and the other Jews were behaving in a manner that Paul disapproved of, and he perceived it as not walking uprightly. Then Paul confronted Peter in front of everyone. If you, being a Jew, live as a Gentile and not as a Jew, why are you forcing the Gentiles to be Jewish? Paul found this statement important enough to include in his letter, and this statement does deserve to be dwelled on and considered thoroughly, because it is revealing. Paul claims that Peter lives as a Gentile and does not live as a Jew. It is not clear what exactly he means by this, though. If we don't have an awareness of the commands, of the Torah, and of Judaism, we might assume he's just talking about the commands given in Exodus through Deuteronomy. However, the behavior that Paul explicitly mentions is the Jews separating from eating with the Gentiles. This is the thing which Peter debated in Acts 10. This is not actually a command from the law. It is not a command from the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. It was a Jewish custom that was not a part of the actual law. So to Paul, not doing this Jewish custom was a part of Peter living as a Gentile. But he also says that Peter was forcing the Gentiles to be Jewish, or forcing the Gentiles to Judaize. How was Peter compelling them to be Jewish? It wouldn't make any sense for this to be referring to that same eating custom. Otherwise, the Gentiles would be separating themselves from Peter and Barnabas, and the whole issue wouldn't have even come up. So it must not be referring to that specifically. So the Apostle Peter was either teaching the Gentiles to follow the law in some sense, or to follow the law and the Jewish customs both in some sense. We can see teachings that favor the law in general in parts of the Gospels. So it would make sense that Peter, being one of the 12 apostles, would teach such a thing that was in the Gospels to the Gentiles. But clearly, according to this story in Galatians, either Peter is condemned and needed to be set straight by Paul, or Paul did not understand what was going on and Peter was totally unable to explain it to him before Paul wrote publicly about it, or Paul had a significant disagreement with the Apostle Peter. There are two things I want us to consider. Why were people from the apostles, the 12 who were present for the teachings of the Gospels, teaching the Gentiles to live like the Jews? Why would they be inclined to teach that way? These were people specifically chosen to carry on the message. If that was not the correct thing to do, then why do we see the 12 foundations representing the 12 apostles, when instead it should be the one single foundation of Paul and the one single throne of Paul that came to set everything straight? Because apparently the actual apostles were not taught well enough in the Gospels. Alongside that, we might consider why there is this distinction of 12 apostles, yet another apostle comes along that writes the majority of the New Testament. A person that opposes the apostles to the face, that did not confer with them, that said they seemed to be pillars, but it mattered nothing to him, that said they added nothing to him. Paul is a person that we don't have an apparent reference to in the Gospels or in Revelation, at least in terms of being a legitimate apostle. Now it is true that we might go to 2 Peter 3:15 and see that 2 Peter refers to Paul as a brother, and the passage warns that Paul's teachings could be misunderstood to one's destruction. But we should also consider that James apparently had the idea that Paul kept and followed the law. In Acts 21:18-24, James and the elders compel Paul to participate in a sacrificial ritual in order to prove that he doesn't teach against circumcision and that he doesn't teach against the law, but instead that he walks correctly and keeps the law. So there was some obvious slippage between these people, or between the different accounts, because we have those who seem to be pillars advocating for some sense of the law and telling Paul to prove to people that he follows the law. Yet Paul in his letter is condemning Peter, standing against him and his teachings, opposing how Peter taught the Gentiles to Judaize. And we also have Paul clearly preaching against circumcision in Galatians and preaching against the written law in 2 Corinthians 3:7. Paul was clearly not in agreement with the apostles, and he made it clear with his own words. This being the case, if we are willing to recognize this, we are also willing to recognize the implications this has for us personally. Just like we may have had a misconception in the past about Paul not disagreeing with the apostles, we may have had some other misconceptions about the Bible or about its teachings. This might include how we view the law. According to Deuteronomy 11:1, the law is followed for all of the days. Even though we may have heard otherwise from Paul or from teachings that were derived from him, things like the law was supposed to apply only for a time, we don't actually see that in the law itself. The Hebrew literally says, his commands are for all the days. Are we still in the midst of days today? Are we still in the midst of all of the days? It also says in Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32 that the commands are not to be changed because they are not to be added to or taken away from, because we are supposed to keep them as they are commanded. These commands are good and right in his sight, according to Deuteronomy 12:28. And it's not a matter of the covenant being broken, Because Leviticus 26 describes the breaking of the covenant, the curse that results from turning away from him and from breaking his covenant. But it concludes in Leviticus 26, 41 through 45, by saying he will remember the covenant. That even though it was broken, he will remember it when the people submit to him. The covenant is remembered. The law continues today. His ways are for all of the days. If his ways are truth and his commands are good and right in his sight, we need to return to them.